Unlike the brutal Germanic tribes of old, or the hardy and resilient Slavic types on the fringes of the European continent, the Italic peoples have always considered themselves to be the more sophisticated of the Indo-European peoples. From the birth of the Roman Empire, the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and many other innovations seen throughout history, it would seem that many of the world's most impacting events in all of human history were the doing of this proud group of people who openly acknowledge and appreciate their shared heritage as the heirs of the Romans, as they all speak descendants of Vulgar Latin, an Italic offshoot, and hence are known as the Latin, Italic, or Romance people. Although I sometimes use the term Italic and Romance languages interchangeably, the Italic languages technically encompass a few other extinct languages of the Italian peninsula, of which Latin was the sole survivor thousands of years ago. Other areas that belonged to the Roman Empire but were never truly Latinized include most of the eastern half, such as Egypt, Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant, who all had much more Greek linguistic and cultural influence than Latin, although other areas that were heavily incorporated yet remain somewhat glossed over in history is the Roman descendants in the Balkans, speaking a Latin-based language known as Dalmatian, the Roman descendants in Great Britain, and lastly those in the Roman provinces of Africa and Mauritania, who spoke a unique Latin-based language even for a time after their conquest by the Vandals and later Muslims, with the former two being conquered by Slavic and Germanic peoples respectively. Had they not, it's quite possible the Latin realm would be much larger than it is today. The only known group in the Western Roman Empire to survive assimilation were the Basques, an ancient group predating the Indo-Europeans by quite some time, with the Celtic Britons and France being more recent arrivals after the Roman conquest. And although the Basques have been partially assimilated in more recent times, they're still genetically and culturally distinct from the neighboring Italic peoples. Some forget that before the 18th century, France was actually a pretty ethnically and linguistically diverse state, with minorities of Celtic Britons, Basques, Germans, Protestant Huguenots, and in the south, the Occitanian language, another Romance language closer to Catalan than French, was spoken natively by the bulk of the populace. However, following the French Revolution, the French state began a process of assimilating these minority groups, leading to a more homogenized national identity. Some of the lesser-known Romance languages outside of French, Portuguese, Catalan, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian include the Raetian languages located in northern Italy and Switzerland, the last of the Roman province of Raetia, the Istriot language on the Istrian Peninsula in modern-day Croatia, last of the Roman province of Dalmatia, and the Sardinian language on the island of Sardinia, which, because of its historically isolated interior, has remained rather unchanged throughout the past couple millennia, with most linguists agreeing the Sardinian language is actually the closest living relative to Old Latin. Romanians, though occasionally teased as being the fringe misfit of the bunch, are still quite an integral part of the Italic world, and in the past, and especially since the fall of the Iron Curtain, huge numbers of Romanians and Moldovans have settled in all Italic countries, from Italy to Portugal. And interestingly, there's also a large number of Vlachs, a fellow Romance people related to Romanians, scattered throughout the Balkans, notably in Serbia, Albania, Greece, and Northern Macedonia. Keep in mind, the Roman Catholic Maltese were formerly a Latin-speaking people as well, with a culture very closely linked to that of neighboring Sicily. However, following the Muslim conquest, the population switched to using a dialect of Arabic that evolved into its own distinct language, with very heavy influence and borrowing from neighboring Italian. Now, if you thought the colonies of the Germanic peoples were impressive, far and away the descendants of colonists from these Italic nations blow the Germanic descendants out of the water, mainly because Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and to a lesser extent French settlers were much more willing and likely to intermarry with the local populations. Although laws of ethnic and racial hierarchy were imposed in colonial Latin America, just like in Northern America, they were much more fluid and relaxed than those in the North, and interracial marriage was legal just about everywhere, and oftentimes encouraged. The Hispanics of the Americas are the descendants of Romans, Incans, conquistadors, Aztecs, Mayans, and many other impressively fierce peoples, and now greatly outnumber those of Spanish descent in Europe, as in the past 500 years there were an incomprehensibly large number of migrants heading for the New World, not to mention their birth rates were quite a bit higher than those who stayed in Europe at around the same standard of living for the time. The French, of course, had settler colonies mostly in Northern America, which were since absorbed by the countries of the United States and Canada, and although the Italians never had any colonies in the Americas per se, ethnic Italians have a long history in both the US and Latin America, with the New York metro area having an Italian plurality, along with a large chunk of the Southern Cone. And besides, one could make the argument that all Romance countries are Italian colonies, since all received a hefty number of colonists from the Italian peninsula during Roman rule. Around 20% of whites in Hispanic America as a whole are of Italian ancestry, principally Argentina and Uruguay, with the local dialect of Spanish Rio Platense having heavy Italian influence, often being described as Spanish spoken with an Italian accent, and the majority of Argentines in the Buenos Aires region have both Italian, Spanish, Basque, and other European ancestry, leading to a unique populace not seen anywhere else, although the Spanish language and culture is clearly dominant. Because of these historic ties through migration and culture, the Latin peoples debatably have far more in common than other ethno-linguistic macro groups, and political unions and unifications have been proposed for quite some time, particularly a Pan-Latin Alliance between Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, and although including the whole of the Italic world was never really seriously considered after the Latin American countries gained independence, let's take a look at what the map of such a country would look like. In Europe, we would be including all of Iberia with the exception of Basque Country west of the Pyrenees, most of France, sans Brittany and Alsace-Lorraine, the southern half of Belgium known as Wallonia, the southern and western portions of Switzerland, all of Italy except South Tyrol, and most of Romania and Moldova in the east, and its population would add up to over 210 million, very close to my approximation of the population of Germanic Europe. In the Americas, there would be three main enclaves of the NYC metro area of mostly Italian, Puerto Rican, and Dominican makeup, French Canada, which has a bit of a bleed over into the maritime Canadian provinces, Ontario, and northern New England, and the Miami metro area in southern Florida, which is a combination of pretty much every Latino nationality out there, who are a plethora of different races and cultures. We would also be including much of the American Southwest near the Mexican border, as well as southern Louisiana connecting this region to the rest of Latin America, although in the rest of Latin America there would be many areas carved out, mostly filled with Native Americans, Africans, or non-Italic Europeans such as Germans or Slavs. The population of this new country would add up to a staggering 900 million people, with over 45% living in the continent of South America. So who would have thought that 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, the area with the largest number of Roman descendants would be half a world away in an as-of-yet undiscovered landmass? Although if we only included unmixed Latin descendants, the map would look a bit more like this, including southern Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. Because the bulk of the population would be located in Latin America, around 3/4 of the entire Pan-Latin Empire would speak one of the two major Iberian languages, Spanish or Portuguese, 51 and 23% respectively, with the Portuguese being particularly impressive on how far they've spread their language, considering the home country only has 10 million people, and the next most spoken languages would be French, Italian, and Romanian, with around 8% speaking a non-Italic language, mostly due to the inclusion of parts of the United States that speak English. Perhaps Latin would be instituted as the lingua franca and official language following incorporation. It would only make sense after all. In terms of ethnic and racial diversity, by using the same criteria used for our last video over Germanic descendants, we'll be able to see that those with some Italic ancestry or major ancestry from these Latin-based nations are well over 3/4 of the population, with many in Latin America not even being aware of their mixed ethnic heritage. However, in a strange inverse of the Germanic world, where 80% of the population was of European heritage, but only 50% was of Germanic stock, In the Latin world, 80% of the population has Latin roots, but only 50% of the population is of European heritage, and many of those Europeans are of Basque, German, or Slavic descent. A further third of the population would be some variant of multiracial Latino, the majority of whom have had mixed bloodlines dating back hundreds of years. And although we tend to simplify the equation by breaking it down to Spanish plus Amerindian, a large chunk may also have varying degrees of African, other European, Asian, Middle Eastern, or even Jewish ancestry. There's also a small minority of Creoles with the Cape Verdeans who are of mixed Portuguese, West African, Jewish, and other European heritage, although technically one could say that Latinos are the world's largest Creole group, even though they don't speak a Creole language. Smaller minorities include blacks, mostly in Brazil, and many of whom have significant Portuguese ancestry, Native Americans, Middle Easterners, and Asians, many of whom would be located in the U.S. portion. Religiously, although the Latin world is obviously thought of as the center of Roman Catholic identity, the European countries are becoming increasingly irreligious, and Spain even recently elected its first atheist prime minister, although Latin America is comparatively much stronger in their faith, and overall around 62% would be Catholic, with another 13% Protestant, mostly in Latin America, and 3% Orthodox, mostly in Romania, who are possibly the most religious out of the bunch, as paradoxically Eastern Europe is full of the most religious and least religious countries in the world. Around 4% would belong to other religions, including 1.6 of whom belong to Islam, probably not as high as you would think, as although France has a very large percentage of Muslims at around 8 to 9%, the vast majority of those of Middle Eastern descent in Latin America are Christian. So in this gargantuan country of 7.9 million square miles, or 20.5 million square kilometers, and a $23.6 trillion economy, it would seem that they have outmatched the ancient Romans in just about every aspect, although at its height, regionally, the Roman Empire probably had a much larger influence. So please let me know your thoughts on this hypothetical Pan-Latin Neo-Roman Empire, and for today's poll, let me know which extinct Latin-based people you would like to know more about. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone. Pax Romana.